Okay, so last night's State of the Union address. I don't know about you, but I'm still processing it all. We're going to take a deep dive today into some articles that really caught my eye. They're all trying to make sense of Trump's second term so far. And, well, there's a lot to unpack.
It's fascinating, isn't it? It's like everyone's trying to figure out what's going on. We've got some really insightful opinion pieces from the New York Times, a deep dive from Tom Hartman on cyber warfare, even some reporting from Wired and Mother Jones. There's a lot to dig into.
Yeah, it feels like a really crucial moment,
Yeah.
like things are shifting in a big way and no one's quite sure where we're headed. So I think it's a good time to step back and take stock of what we know so far.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that struck me the most was this theme of shock and awe. Thomas Friedman's piece in the New York Times, America Became Great Because of the Things Trump Hates, really hit on that.
Yeah, Friedman's basically drawing a parallel between the 2003 invasion of Iraq and what Trump and Musk are doing now. Like this rapid, sweeping change that's meant to disrupt the existing system. But is it effective governance or just destructive chaos? That's the question, right?
Right. And Friedman argues that just like the invasion of Iraq, this kind of shock and awe approach might have some initial success, but it's ultimately unsustainable. He's worried about the long-term consequences of gutting government agencies without a clear plan for what comes next.
He even brought up concerns about diseases like polio and malaria making a comeback because of cuts to foreign aid. It's a stark reminder that we live in a interconnected world, right?
Right.
What might seem like a distant problem can very quickly become everyone's problem.
Exactly. And Friedman also points out that the administration seems way more focused on cutting than building. There's not a lot of talk about what they're actually trying to create, just what they want to destroy. It's unsettling, to say the least.
Yeah, and it kind of ties into this other big theme that emerged from these articles. Trump's focus on personal loyalty, above all else. It's like he's created his own court, where allegiance matters more than competence.
Several articles touched on this, including Jamel Bouie's piece in the Times. He argues that Trump's primary motivation is ego and revenge. He's appointing people not because they're qualified, but because they're willing to attack his enemies.
Yeah, like removing security protection from former officials who he sees as disloyal, even though there have been credible death threats against them. It's like, wow.
Exactly. Bowie even goes so far as to suggest that Trump might be trying to get revenge on the American people for voting him out in 2020. It's a pretty chilling thought.
Chilling is a good word for it. And speaking of power players, we can't forget about Musk. David French in the Times called Musk's Department of Government Efficiency government spending cut theater.
It's all about optics, right? French argues the DOGE is focused on symbolic targets instead of real solutions. He points out that even if Musk fired a quarter of all federal employees, it would only amount to a 1% reduction in spending.
It does feel like a lot of smoke and mirrors. And the lack of transparency around DOGE is especially concerning. No one seems to know who's really in charge or how they're making decisions. It's like this black box of power.
Right, and it raises questions about accountability and whether these actions are truly serving the public good.
Yeah.
Who benefits from this lack of transparency? What are the long-term implications of such concentrated, unchecked power? These are questions we need to be asking.
Absolutely. And while all this is happening, there is some pushback. We saw it last night during the State of the Union, especially from Rep. Al Green.
Green's actions were certainly dramatic. He was ultimately ejected for yelling at Trump during the speech, accusing him of not having a mandate to govern and calling for his impeachment. Some might see it as grandstanding, others as a necessary act of defiance. It depends on your perspective, I suppose.
Mother Jones had a piece that really captured the energy of the Democratic response last night. They wore pink in protest, held up signs with messages like Musk steals and staged walkouts. But is this enough? Is it even the right approach?
That's the question, isn't it? David Graham argues in The Atlantic that Democrats need a more unified and forceful strategy if they're going to counter Trump's agenda and capture public attention. He thinks their current approach is too fragmented and reactive. They need a clearer, more compelling alternative vision for the future.
So on one hand, you've got Trump and Musk consolidating power, driven by ego and a desire for control. And on the other, you've got this kind of scattered resistance trying to figure out how to fight back.
And all of this is happening against a backdrop of increasing economic uncertainty and social division. It's a volatile mix. A lot of people are worried, and rightfully so.
It's definitely a lot to process. But before we start talking about solutions or strategies for resistance, there's another piece of this puzzle that we need to address, and it's a pretty chilling one.
You're talking about the threat of cyber warfare, aren't you?
Exactly. Tom Hartman's article really drives home the point that we're facing an entirely new kind of battleground, one where our enemies can cripple our nation without ever setting foot on our soil.
It's a sobering thought. And Hartman argues that the Trump administration's dismantling of cybersecurity infrastructure, like firing the cybersecurity coordinator, has left the U.S. incredibly vulnerable.
And he uses a specific and frankly terrifying example. Back in 2015, Russia shut down the power grid in Ukraine. They crippled hospitals, banks, even took down monitoring systems at Chernobyl. Imagine the chaos if something like that happened here.
It's a wake-up call. Cyber warfare isn't some distant threat anymore. It's a clear and present danger, and we need to be prepared.
So we've got this external threat from Russia, coupled with the internal chaos fueled by Trump and Musk's actions. It's a recipe for disaster. But there's one more piece of this puzzle that we need to discuss before we can even begin to think about solutions. It's the money trail. Wired reports that business leaders are paying millions of dollars for access to Trump at Mar-a-Lago. Like $5 million for a one-on-one meeting. What are they getting in return for those exorbitant sums? It makes you wonder.
And then you have Mother Jones highlighting the cozy relationship between Trump and big tech. Companies like Amazon and CNN are softening their coverage in exchange for favorable treatment. It makes you think about the information we consume and whose interests are being served.
It's like we're living in a dystopian novel. An authoritarian ruler consolidates power, a shadowy tech mogul controls the levers of government, and the media is complicit in spreading propaganda. It's a pretty bleak picture, honestly.
It's definitely a lot to unpack, but the question is, what can we do about it? How do we navigate this complex and potentially treacherous landscape?
That's the big question, isn't it? And one that deserves careful consideration. But I think it's time for us to take a step back and digest all of this information before we dive into potential solutions. What do you think?
I agree. We've covered a lot of ground and there's much more to explore. But for now, let's give our listener a moment to reflect on what we've discussed so far.
So we've painted this pretty bleak picture, right? Power grabs, hidden agendas, cyber warfare. It's a lot to wrap your head around. Where do we even begin to make sense of it all?
It's true. The situation is incredibly complex and it's easy to feel overwhelmed. But it's important to remember that we're not powerless. We still have the ability to think critically, to engage in meaningful dialogue, and to take action.
But with so much information swirling around, so much of it contradictory or just plain wrong, how do we even know where to start? How do we cut through all the noise and figure out what's actually going on?
That's a crucial question, and it highlights the importance of what we were talking about earlier, the need for critical thinking and media literacy. We can't just passively absorb information anymore. We have to be active participants, questioning assumptions, evaluating sources, and thinking for ourselves.
So it's not just about reading more news. It's about reading it differently.
Yeah.
We have to ask ourselves, who's writing this? Why are they saying this? What's their agenda?
Exactly. We need to look for evidence, consider different perspectives, and be wary of information that's designed to provoke a strong emotional response without offering any real substance.
So it's like being a detective, right? We need to look for clues, evaluate the evidence, and try to piece together the most accurate picture possible.
Precisely. And it's also important to be aware of our own biases. What are our preconceived notions? What are we predisposed to believe? It's only by acknowledging our own blind spots that we can truly start to see things clearly.
This makes me think about Rick Green and his actions during the State of the Union address. He was clearly trying to make a statement, to call attention to what he sees as a real abuse of power. Was it grandstanding, or was it a necessary act of defiance?
That's a question that people are going to answer in different ways. Some will say that it was disruptive and ultimately ineffective. Others will see it as a courageous act of resistance against a president they believe has gone too far.
And it's interesting to consider Green's actions in the context of the broader resistance movement. We see Democrats in Congress staging walkouts, wearing pink in protest, holding up signs. Are these tactics effective? Are they enough to counter the forces we've been talking about?
That's the debate, isn't it? Some argue that these actions are mostly symbolic, that they don't have any real impact. Others maintain that they're important for raising awareness, for signaling that there's opposition, for keeping the pressure on.
It seems like there's no easy answer. Different people will have different ideas about the best way to resist, based on their own values and how much risk they're willing to take.
Absolutely. There's no one-size-fits-all approach. But I think it's important to remember that every act of resistance, no matter how small it might seem, can contribute to a larger movement for change.
So even something as simple as having a conversation with a friend about these issues or sharing an article on social media can actually make a difference.
Exactly. Think of it like planting seeds. Each conversation, each act of awareness raising plants a seed that has the potential to grow into something much bigger. We never know how our actions might inspire others or ripple outwards.
So it's not necessarily about grand gestures or taking down the system overnight. It's about consistently pushing back, engaging in dialogue, and supporting those who are working for positive change.
Exactly. And it's about remembering that we're not alone in this. There are millions of people who share our concerns, who are working in their own ways to create a better future. We need to connect with those people, build coalitions, and support each other.
That makes sense. But amidst all of this, how do we avoid falling into despair? It's easy to get bogged down by the negativity, especially when it feels like we're constantly bombarded with bad news.
That's a very real concern. It's crucial to protect our mental and emotional well-being. One way to do that is by consciously choosing to focus on solutions, not just problems.
So instead of just reading about everything that's wrong, we can also seek out stories about people who are making a difference, organizations working for change, initiatives creating a positive impact in the world.
Precisely. It's about shifting our attention from what's broken to what's possible, reminding ourselves that even in the darkest of times, there are still glimmers of hope and people working towards a better future.
And that's a good point. And what about the psychological impact of living with this constant sense of uncertainty and chaos? How do we cope with that feeling of dread that seems to hang over everything?
It's important to acknowledge those feelings. It's okay to feel overwhelmed, anxious, even afraid. These are normal reactions to a very abnormal situation.
So we shouldn't beat ourselves up for feeling stressed or anxious.
Exactly. Give yourself permission to feel those emotions, but don't let them consume you. Find healthy ways to process them, whether it's exercise, meditation, creative expression, talking to a therapist, whatever works for you.
And I imagine limiting our exposure to the 24/7 news cycle can also be helpful. It's important to stay informed, but we don't need to be constantly bombarded with negativity.
Absolutely. Set boundaries around your news consumption. Choose specific times to check in and be selective about the sources you trust. And remember, it's okay to take breaks from the news altogether when you need to recharge.
So it's all about finding that balance, staying informed and engaged, but also protecting our mental and emotional well-being.
Exactly. And remember, you're not alone in this. We're all navigating this challenging landscape together. Reach out to your friends, family, and community for support. Share your struggles, offer encouragement, and remind each other that even small acts of kindness and compassion can make a difference.
That's a good reminder. It's easy to feel isolated and powerless when we're facing these kinds of challenges, but remembering that we're part of a larger community can help us stay grounded and hopeful.
And that sense of connection and community can be a powerful antidote to the fear and division that's being sown by those in power. We're stronger together.
Okay, so we've talked about critical thinking, resisting apathy, finding our own ways to contribute, taking care of our mental health. But there's one more piece of this puzzle that we need to address before we wrap up.
And what's that?
Well, earlier you mentioned this convergence of power, technology, and information control. I'm really curious to hear more about that.
That's where things get really interesting and potentially even more concerning. Let's dive into that in our final segment.
All right, so you were saying that things get even more interesting and potentially concerning when we look at how power, technology, and information control are all coming together.
Yeah, it's like we're seeing this perfect storm brewing. You've got Trump with his constant attacks on the truth, his attempts to discredit any source of information that challenges his narrative. It's like he's waging war on facts, trying to undermine trust in institutions.
Yeah, we saw that throughout his first term, and it just seems like it's ramped up even more now. It's like he's built his own reality, one where facts don't matter and the only currency is loyalty.
Exactly. And then you have this other thing happening at the same time. You've got social media and these really powerful algorithms that shape what we see and hear online. These platforms are designed to keep us engaged, but sometimes that means feeding us content that's misleading, divisive, even completely false.
And remember that Mother Jones article we talked about. They pointed out how a lot of these big tech companies are actually getting pretty cozy with the Trump administration, softening their coverage in exchange for favorable treatment. It really makes you think about whose interests are being served when we get our news from these sources.
Exactly. So you have this president who's trying to erode trust in traditional media, while at the same time, he's benefiting from the reach and influence of these huge tech platforms. It's a dangerous combination, It creates this environment where misinformation and propaganda can spread really easily.
And it's not just about spreading lies, right? It's also about controlling the narrative, shaping how people see things, silencing voices that disagree. It's about holding on to power by controlling the information that people have access to.
You got it. Think about how Trump used Twitter during his first term. He used it to attack his opponents, spread conspiracy theories, bypass the media, and talk directly to his supporters. And now, with Musk involved in DOGE, it feels like we're seeing something similar, but maybe with even bigger consequences.
Right, and remember those reports about DOGE messing with the federal budget website? So like they're trying to make it harder for people to find out how the government is spending their money.
Exactly. And if people don't have the information, how can they hold their leaders accountable? It's straight out of the authoritarian playbook. Control the information, create a sense of fear and uncertainty, and then position yourself as the only one who can provide stability.
So if we're living in this world where information is a weapon, how do we protect ourselves?
Yeah.
How do we even know what to believe anymore?
It's a tough question, no doubt, but I think it comes back to what we were talking about before. Critical thinking and media literacy. We have to be much more careful about the information we consume. We can't just be passive sponges soaking it all up. We have to be more like detectives, you know?
So it's not just about reading more, it's about reading smarter, asking ourselves, who's writing this? Why are they saying this? What are they trying to get me to believe?
Exactly. We need to look for evidence, consider different perspectives, and be very wary of anything that seems designed to get a big emotional reaction without much substance behind it.
We have to be more skeptical, more questioning. And that means being aware of our own biases, too. What do we already believe? What are we inclined to accept without much scrutiny?
Right, because sometimes we're more likely to believe something if it already fits into our worldview, even if it's not really true. So we have to be willing to challenge our own assumptions, be open to hearing different points of view.
So read widely, listen to diverse voices, and don't be afraid to have conversations with people who see things differently than you do.
You got it. And don't forget, even sources we trust can get things wrong. So it's good to have a healthy dose of skepticism about everything, even from sources you generally agree with. It's all about staying curious, keeping an open mind, and always being willing to learn.
So trust but verify, like that old saying goes. We can't just accept everything we hear at face value. We have to think for ourselves.
Absolutely. And the good news is we do have more power than we might realize. We have control over what we choose to consume, how we engage with information, and who we choose to support.
Right. We can choose to amplify voices that are telling the truth, to support organizations that are fighting for transparency and accountability, and to create our own content that challenges the stories we're being told.
Exactly. It's about taking an active role in shaping the information landscape, not just defending ourselves against bad information, but also actively promoting good information.
And that's where the real hope lies, right? In our ability to think critically, to have these conversations, to demand better from our leaders and institutions. That's how we create real change.
It all comes down to education, awareness, and action. We have to be informed, we have to be critical thinkers, and we have to be willing to act both on our own and together to protect the things we value.
Well said. It's been quite a journey exploring these ideas about power, information, and resistance. It can feel overwhelming, but ultimately it's empowering to know that we're not powerless. We have agency, we have choices, and we can make a difference.
That's a great note to end on. Remember, you're not alone in this. There are so many people out there who share your concerns and are working towards a better future. Find those people, connect with them, support each other, and never, ever give up hope.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back next time with another exploration of the issues that matter most. Until then, stay informed, stay engaged, and keep fighting for the world you want to see.